Thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to present my work with Moramay Lopez-Alonso, which addresses the mechanics behind migrant cell selection in the presence of random shocks. As you may know, international migration is a selective process, with some individuals choosing to leave their country of birth and others choosing to stay. In this sense, migrants could have, on average, more or less productive skills than those left behind, and consequently be positively or negatively self-selected. In fact, the quality of migrants has been a persistent concern among natives of immigrant receiving countries and a common topic in the public sphere since the very beginnings of mass migration back in the 1850s. Due to its relevance, uh, to predict the direction of self-selection, previous literature focuses on systemic drivers, namely earnings inequality and migration costs. However, since changes in these drivers are long-run processes, this literature gives the impression that self-selection patterns would tend to remain sticky in the short run. However, there is a growing body of literature that addresses shifts in self-selection. Most of them focus on evaluating the impact of immigration policy on the composition of migration. However, we believe that the implementation of immigration restrictions are usually done with long lags, allowing immigrants to anticipate and adjust to them. There is also another group of literature that exploits economic shocks. For example, in his forthcoming paper, Monraz argues that on the basis of experience and schooling, Mexican migrants, the composition of Mexican migrants didn't change during the financial crisis of 1995, which also is known as the tequila crisis. In contrast, Villarreal documents that the composition of migration based on education did change during the Great Recession. And from a more historical perspective, Collins and Simran argues that Irish migration changed during the Irish famine period. So the common denominator across this literature is that they use relatively low frequency data on migration. Therefore, it is difficult to design a study addressing the responsiveness of migrant self-selection to changes in the economic environment. To fill this void in the literature, our research asks two questions. Can migrant self-selection change in the short run? And if so, through which mechanisms? To answer these questions, we do three things. First, we quantify the selectivity of Mexican migration in the early 20th century using human stature as a proxy for physical productivity of labor. Second, to identify short-run shifts in migrant self-selection, we exploit a large but temporary shock that affected unexpectedly the demand of Mexican workers. And finally, using Chiquiaran Hanson selection model, we study the role of labor recruiting as a short-run adjustment channel of migrant self-selection. For you to have an idea of the results of our research, in the next slides, I will try to convince you that in the early 20th century, Mexican migration was characterized by an intermediate or positive selection. Also, that in the absence of immigration restrictions, migrant self-selection is very responsive to short-run changes in the economic environment. Actually, I will show you that the composition of migration changed in a matter of months. And finally, we will argue that there are two types of labor recruiting, and when labor recruiting is practiced assortatively, it can shape and adjust migrant self-selection in the short run. The remainder of my presentation is organized as follows. First, I will introduce to you the historical context of the research. Then I will address the intuition behind using human stature as a measure of selection and our data sources. Afterwards, I will address the empirical strategy and I will present the first set of results. And afterwards, I will elaborate a little bit more on the labor recruiting and its effect on shaping the composition of migration. And at the end, I will offer some concluding remarks. So regarding the historical context, so we choose to study Mexican migration in the early 20th century because this period represents a unique setting to study selection into migration. From the supply side, Mexican mass migration started and Mexicans could cross the border without restrictions. And this is very important because, in contrast to research that is framed in contemporary periods, our results are unlikely to be influenced by under-enumeration of undocumented migration, and certainly are not contaminated by the presence of immigration restrictions that artificially change the composition of migration. From the demand side, during this period, the United States emerged as the leading manufacturing economy. And for you to have an idea of its economic performance, the average annual GDP growth rates were about 5%. This robust economic performance was possible due to a growing and dynamic financial system that operated without regulation. The absence of this regulation favored the development of speculative processes that limited the liquidity of the economy and eventually generated a financial breakdown. This important financial breakdown is known as the Panic of 1907. It took place between August 1907 and January 1908. And as you can imagine now, it will be the economic shock that we will be exploiting to identify short-run shifts in migrant self-selection. So a little bit more about the Panic of 1907. This was the most important financial crisis in the United States before the Great Depression, and it counts with three important characteristics that makes it a natural experiment of history in the context of our research. So first, the Panic of 1907 was importantly influenced by the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. So in other words, it is an unexpected shock. So it cannot be anticipated by immigrants. Second, during the Panic of 1907, banks and financial institutions of many cities limited or suspended their cash payments. In other words, it was a financial crisis that affected all sectors of the economy in the United States. And it was a very relevant shock to Mexican migration. And third, and probably most important, is that although this financial crisis became a worldwide affair, in Mexico, no bank collapsed or went bankrupt, and there were no losses for bill holders or depositors. So this last characteristic is very important because this allows us to keep fixed the economic conditions from the supply side. And therefore, we can identify better the shifts in migrant self-selection. However, this period presents a very important challenge. There is no earnings data for this period for Mexico, the United States, or probably saying with more accuracy, the data available is scattered and unreliable. Therefore, we needed to find a relevant measure of selection. For this reason, we choose human stature because, as you may know, it is a very good proxy for physical productivity and earnings. And this is because you may be aware that wealthier people have better access to food, hygienic conditions, and medical resources throughout their lives, and consequently, they tend to be taller than the poor. In addition, taller individuals develop better cognitive abilities, reach higher levels of education, and tend to earn more as adults. So overall, height is indicative of earnings, but it is even more important in context where large sectors of the economy rely on physical productivity of labor, which in fact was the case of Mexico in the early 20th century. From a more methodological perspective, a human stature cannot be manipulated in anticipation of or in response to migration, making it an ideal observable to quantify and study selection into migration. Okay. Any questions regarding my measure of selection? Because it's common that I receive some questions here. Okay. So our data sources. As in any other research addressing migrant cell selection, we will use a sample of migrants, but in this case, we will compare them against 3 different samples of individuals that choose to remain in Mexico. Our sample of migrants come from daily individual border crossings registered at 9 entrance ports along the Mexico-US border from 1906 to 1908. You can see in the map the geographic location of these entrance ports, and well, it's very clear that they are distributed along the border except for the region of the desert. So this is very important to take into account because to some extent, we argue that we are not capturing any patterns of migration or any additional selection patterns based on the entrance ports. Also, the map depicts the immigrants' region of birth that we will be using as a control to estimate with more accuracy our initial selection patterns. The region that is slightly shaded here is known as the Bajío region, or the traditional Mexican migration region. And I'm just mentioning it because in the next slides, this name will appear constantly. So for you to keep in mind that the Bajío region is the central plateau region of the country. Okay, so I also wanted to show you, probably you may be interested, how the historical records look like from where we obtain these microdata and all the transcription work that we did to obtain this novel microdata set. So our comparison samples come from 3 different sources. First, they come from military records of ordinary soldiers that were known at the time as the Federales. We also use military records of elite forces, military elite forces that were known as the Rurales. And finally, we use records of passport applications. These 3 different samples are used to represent 3 different parts of Mexico's height distribution. And the explanation is the following. The ordinary samples will represent the lower ranks of Mexico's height distribution because being an ordinary soldier at the time was probably the only outside option for farmers without land or for peasants. So overall, they will represent the poorest ranks of Mexico's population at that time. The military elite will represent the intermediate ranks of Mexico's height distribution because it's very well documented that the Rurales received a clearly higher wage than the ordinary soldiers. But more importantly, in order to be enlisted in this military elite force, they have to bring with them their own horse and other equipment, which was relatively costly at that time. So overall, they will represent the middle social class of Mexico. And finally, the passport application sample will represent the upper ranks or the very top ranks of Mexico's height distribution at that time. And for you to understand this, at that time, it was not necessary to have a passport in order to migrate to the United States, but it was compulsory to have a passport to migrate to Europe. And at that time, if you want to move to Europe, it was mainly to pursue some leisure or to carry out studies abroad. So this sample, the passport application sample, will be capturing the Mexican elite at that time, the Mexican social elite at that time, okay? And well, we applied a series of refinements to these samples in order to obtain the best results possible. The most important refinement is that since we are working with height, with human stature, we keep individuals that reach the terminal height. That is, individuals between 22 years of age and 65. Yeah, so these are the initial descriptives of our 4 samples. You can see that there's clear variation in terms of height. We also include in this table the labor class category. I have to mention that they reported their last occupation in Mexico before crossing the border. And also we have the last occupation before the enrollment in the military for our comparison samples. So a common question that I receive is that why we didn't use these occupation categories to estimate the selectivity of Mexican migration. Well, we didn't use it because for migrants, the occupation was self-reported, and therefore we believe that that can introduce additional biases to our estimates. In contrast, the height of the individual was taken by a medic, and therefore we believe that it's a more objective measure of selection. Another potential concern is the presence of a threshold to enlisted in the military, meaning a minimum requirement of height. So for that reason, we plot our kernel density estimates. And as you can see, our 4 samples behave pretty normal. So we are not concerned about any truncation problems that could bias our results as well. So our empirical strategy estimates differences in height between migrants and each comparison sample.
David, just one question from Wagner Oliveira, which is, are there probable differences among the different races, for instance, indigenous population, that might be correlated with the height and hence the migrant profile?
Yes, that's actually a very good question. And I think that it's important to clarify it. So it is difficult, well, it's impossible for us to identify the different races of Mexican migrants with the data that we have. Meaning, I think that the question regards on whether migrants were or came from an indigenous population, or they had more Spanish heritage, more European heritage, and therefore that will be reflected on the average height. I totally agree, we cannot control for that because the only thing that we observe is whether they were Mexican citizens or not in our microdata. However, we believe that to some extent we control for that using our region of birth categories, because in general, the indigenous population in Mexico is concentrated in the southeast of the country. So we will be controlling for that. In addition, I will show you in the next slide that we substitute, as a robustness check, we substitute the region of birth categories by state of birth fixed effects, and therefore we additionally control for that, but it's a very, very good question. Thank you. Yeah, so in order to estimate differences in height, we pool our migrant sample with each comparison sample, and therefore our estimated phi coefficient will be capturing differences in height between migrants, the federales, the rurales, and the passport holders, respectively. So we regress height of individual I on an indicator variable for migrants and a set of controls. This set of controls are the skill level categories and the region of birth. Also, we include year of birth fixed effects in order to control for factors that may have influenced height across years, namely access to healthcare, nutrition, disease environment, or some climate shocks that could have affected the living standards of the population over time, right? So what I want to transmit here is that our regression is very, 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 very tight. At the end, we will be comparing individuals that were born in the same year, in the same region. I will show you that we will be comparing individuals that were born in the same state and that they reported the same occupation at the moment of the crossing or at the moment of enlisting. So at the end, the intuition of this empirical strategy is to compare like with like. The only difference, let's say, observable difference between the two individuals will be that one migrated and other stayed. Okay, so the first set of results show that on the basis of height, migrants were clearly taller than the ordinary soldiers, slightly taller than the military elite, and clearly shorter than the passport holders. So overall, we can say that they were drawn from some ranks above the mean, but clearly below the very top ranks. So we can say that Mexican migration was characterized by an intermediate or positive self-selection. If we consider only the Mexican working class, they certainly were drawn from the very top ranks of the height distribution. And here, these are the results that we obtain when we substitute the region of birth for the state of birth fixed effects. You can see that our results remain insignificant in terms of statistically significant, and their magnitude remains very similar as well. Now, in order to identify short-run shifts in migrant cell selection, we add to our previous specification time period interactions that will allow us to quantify differences in height between migrants that moved during the panic and post-panic period relative to pre-panic migrants, okay? And the results are the following. So you can see that it is very clear that during the panic period, migrants became less positively self-selected. On average, they were 1 centimeter shorter than their pre-panic peers. In these first 3 columns, you can see that differences in height relative to the post-panic migrants are not statistically significant, meaning that in principle, the self-selection patterns return to their pre-panic levels after the panic. However, when we substitute our region of birth categories for the state of birth fixed effects, we obtain that at the local level, self-selection patterns change importantly after the panic. So we actually observed that migrants became strongly positively self-selected after the panic relative to their pre-panic peers, okay? So I think that this is very strong evidence suggesting that indeed migrant self-selection can change in the short run, or that it is very responsive. And for you to actually observe the responsiveness of migrant self-selection, well, you can see here in this adjusted height figure that it follows very well the shock's timing. You can see that by May 1907, the US had fallen into a short but severe recession. By August 1907, the Secretary of the Treasury actually announced the deposit of $28 million to banks across the United States to relieving the expected stringency. And therefore, you can see here like a kind of stabilization of our measure of selection. However, this was not enough. And then we observed the panic here in October. We saw the drop in our measure of selection, and then we observed the recovery. Just for you to know, in January 1908, the payments to depositors of commercial banks were fully restored, right? So there is when everything went to normal again. Now, and I think that is the most interesting part of the paper. So to explain.
David, may I ask you just a question on the first part? What happens if you don't control for the skill composition? Because I was thinking that the skill composition itself is a mechanism of self-selection that may change. Yeah. So maybe your coefficient might be even larger if you don't put these controls in.
Yeah, exactly. So basically what you are asking is what the unconditional results would look like. And
Yeah.
yeah, actually I have it here. And you can see that, yes, they change a bit, but only when regarding the passport holders, right? And the reason is the following. The reason is that you may want to include the skill controls depending on how much you believe that the comparison samples are selected in themselves or not. And that is the main question. So what we did, we performed the selection test of Bodenhorn et al. In order to see if we have some time-varying selection bias there. However, when we implemented it, we find that there is no selection. We also implement Comlon's and Ahern selection test, and we find a very slight selection there. So overall, we think that if there is any selection, we can control it by adding these skill controls, right? So to some extent, we are netting out these selection biases that could arise. But as you can see, if we do not include the, well, we can agree that the region of birth categories are super important, but if we do not include the skill level categories, well, you will see that the results are pretty much the same. The only one that changes is regarding the passports, that it's even higher, right? But yeah, probably our passport samples are the one that presents the highest bias. But I mean, we feel comfortable with our results.
Thank you.
So returning to
just so you know, you have 5 minutes left.
Okay.
A little bit more than 5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. So so what's the role of labor recruiting in this story? Well, to answer this question, we use Chikara Hansen's selection model. And in contrast to the simple Borja selection model, Chikara Hansen considers that migration costs decrease with the skill, and that migration costs are very large. So this is an extension of the simple Borja's model. So what these conditions give us is a nonlinear relationship between the net wages and skill, right? You can see it here in this diagram. And these two conditions will provide us the possibility to observe an intermediate migration, intermediate selection, sorry, but more importantly, to observe changes in the degree and direction of selection. And this is because individuals that are in the lowest ranks of the skill distribution will be priced out due to the high migration costs. And on the other hand, the very top ranks of the skill distribution won't migrate because the returns to skill are higher in Mexico relative to the United States. So also we can agree that in general, labor recruiting reduces migration costs to every immigrant or to every individual willing to migrate. So therefore, that is important to consider. The mechanism through which labor recruiting will affect will be through migration costs. Now, in order to observe significant effects of labor recruiting, we have to consider that it should be practiced extensively or should be importantly involved in the immigration process, right? And when it is importantly involved, it can be practiced in two ways, randomly and assortatively. So when individuals are recruited randomly, what we will observe is that in the presence of labor recruiting, more individuals from both ends of the skill distribution will migrate. But what if it is practiced assortatively, meaning that recruiters will choose individuals from a specific section of the skill distribution? Well, they will fix a threshold based on an observable skill, and then they will affect the composition of migration. The diagram that you can see here actually shows a scenario where labor recruiters choose the tallest individuals, meaning from the upper half of the skill distribution, that in this case, our measure of selection is height. And therefore, you will see that in the presence of labor recruiting, more individuals from the upper tail of the height distribution will migrate. In other words, an effect towards a positive self-selection. But the other scenario is true. If there is the presence of labor recruiting and for an exogenous reason it stops, then we will see a decrease in the number of individuals that migrated from the upper tail of the height distribution. And this is actually what happened during the panic of 1907, and I will show you, I will try to convince you in the next slides. So our labor recruiting system that we will be studying is called the enganche. It was a colonial system of labor recruiting that was characterized by offering transportation at wages in advance in exchange of future labor service. So they reduce migration costs, as I have argued. However, an important methodological challenge of our paper is that we do not observe directly enganche migrants. So we have to find a way to identify them. So in order to identify them, we estimate CT scores in order to identify peaks in crossings, because the enganche was characterized by migration of a large number of individuals, and therefore we can identify them. So another characteristic is that in order to migrate in large numbers, you needed to use the railways. So as a robustness check, let's say, we plot the geographical distribution of the places where enganche was practiced, and you can see that it matches very well. So all of them have direct access to railways, and they came from densely populated locations, meaning where they were labor market pressures, okay? So we are very comfortable with our methodology as well. So what happened during the panic? Well, you can see that during the panic, the practice of labor recruiting stopped completely, basically, because since there were constraints in the liquidity of the American economy, American recruiters were not able to continue recruiting, and therefore the presence of the enganche was almost eliminated, as in the case that I explained in the diagram. So in order to estimate the enganche effect, we add to our previous specification an enganche dummy, and I will walk you in the last minute through the main results of our paper. So these results regard or are relative to the military elite at the time. You will see that when we run the simple estimation, migrants are slightly taller than the military elite. However, when we add the dummy variable for enganche migrants, it's very clear that they are considerably taller than non-enganche migrants, and therefore we show that recruiters choose the tallest laborers. These are the results during the panic, including the time period dummies, and when we include or we control for the enganche effect, you can see this difference in the pre-panic period when the enganche was practiced, and it actually contributes to a 23% of the selection effect. When we substitute the regional categories for the state of birth fixed effects, we find the same results, although they are not significant, and well, that is something that probably is due to the sample size. So just to conclude, I think that our paper contributes to two streams of literature. To the economic history literature, we show that the very first Mexican migrants were positively self-selected, and this result aligns with recent literature arguing that Mexican migrants are not drawn from the lower ranks of the educational ability or high distribution, and I think that is pretty informative for current debates, showing that the historical selectivity of migrants can inform debates that are ongoing in immigration policy. And for the labor economics literature, I think that we show that in the absence of immigration restrictions, migrant self-selection can be very responsive to short-term changes in the economic environment. And we confirm that the presence of labor institutions sufficiently involved in the immigration process can shape migrant self-selection. Finally, we have a strong evidence suggesting that assortative labor recruiting can adjust the degree and the direction of migrant self-selection. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for the presentation. It was really interesting one. I'll invite everyone to write their questions in the chat, or you can also raise your hands if you want to ask a question. And maybe we can start by Elsa. Elsa, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thanks to David for his nice presentation, really interesting, really thanks. And I just would like to know if you know if your microdata, if the migrant crossed the border alone or with family members. And another question I have is that reading your paper, I think that I read that you have the data on the last residence of the migrant. So I would like to know if you could exploit it, because maybe the taller and more productive one are also the more mobile one internally in Mexico.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah. Both of them very interesting question. Yes, it is a very rich micro data set. Yes, we have the names of the immigrants, so we can link them with the US Census. I actually plan to do it. It is one of my projects, and therefore we can study the assimilation of the very first Mexican migrants in the United States. So yeah, we can link them. The second question, yes, it's true. We have two locations: the location of birth and the last permanent residence location. And the short answer is the impact of internal migration on this selectivity is almost non-existent. I have a recent published paper in the Journal of Historical Methods where we show that actually internal migration did happen, but it happened mainly within states and within immigration regions. The share of migrants that move across regions, and therefore that we could be capturing any effects of this internal migration because the economic conditions may have changed from the supply side, it's almost non-existent. It's about 2% of the individuals. So we checked for that, and we believe that we are not capturing any effects derived from internal immigration. But yeah, thank you very much. Very relevant question.
Great data and great work with this data. Nice.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions from participants? Otherwise, in the meantime, I would like to ask you, coming back on the questions on the fact that you can't directly control for the different groups, races, for instance, the indigenous population, but also whether that would make a difference in terms of the height. Do you have an idea in what direction the bias might go in? Would you expect the indigenous population to be?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. The indigenous population in Mexico is very varied. So we will have some indigenous population in the north that they are actually very, very tall. And we will have in the southeast indigenous population that they tend to be shorter than the average. So this is one way to explain it. However, something that probably I didn't have much time to describe better is that most of our migration data come from two regions: the border region and the central plateau region. So, and as I explained previously, the bulk of the indigenous population in Mexico is located in the southeast. And when I'm saying that most of our data come from these two regions, is that 98% of our migrants came from these two regions, meaning the Bajío and the border region. So it's difficult to predict to which side this bias of indigenous population may affect our result. But in any case, we think that the number of indigenous population migrating should be relatively small. Another way to do that or to confirm that will be to analyze the names of the migrants. We tried, but I don't know if you may be aware, but in Mexico, most of the indigenous population was renamed using Spanish names. So it is very difficult to disentangle this bias through the names. Yeah, I think that's the answer that I have for now.
Yeah, I think it answers also the question I had, the follow-up suggestions and the one in the chat, which was whether you could use the names to identify the ethnicity, and then you can go for that. But yeah. Okay, so do we have any more questions from the participants? Okay, so thank you so much for this presentation. It was really, really interesting.